So you want to be funny at the table. How? This is probably the hardest one. I don't think you need to throw away all your free time and become a stand-up or an improv comedian, but dabbling a little bit would certainly help. But it isn't necessary. Before deciding to implement comedy at a table that hasn't seen it yet, or at least hasn't seen it to the same degree, make sure that you check out my video on when and where. Implementation without consideration can cause some problems. If you want to use comedy at the table, consider two different approaches, the stand-up approach and the improv approach. Now they work in different ways at different tables in different moments. If you can use skills from both, then your chances of success increase substantially. The stand-up approach involves critical examination. You ask the questions that other people don't think to ask or are afraid to ask. If something doesn't quite make sense, you question it, you argue it. Not to say that you're immediately arguing something at the table, because arguing isn't funny in and of itself, generally. To make it funny, you need to think. You need to process. You need to be able to draw conclusions and observations that are surprising and apt. The stand-up approach of comedy in D&D is primarily out of character. For example, if you see an NPC that is very burly, masculine, has a very impressive mustache, it might remind you of Ron Swanson from Parks and Rec. That's a quick reference that you could make and possibly get a laugh, assuming the other players around you are fans of the show. You could also refine it a little bit. So it's not just you saying, "Is that Ron Swanson?" But you could go deeper and make a joke about the character, whether it be referencing the ex-wife Tammy, challenging him to a burger cook-off, or offering him all the bacon and eggs you have. Of course, being out of character, this is more so just like a throwaway aside to the other players around you. The improv approach involves immersion with the absurd. You recognize the question and you dive into it. Instead of shining a light on this situation out of character, you do so in character. With Ron Swanson NPC, instead of making that comment or joke as yourself, find a way to play with the Ron Swanson here in character. That might look like offering this NPC steak, scotch, and a movie, or whatever the D&D equivalent of movies is. Do that in character. And if your DM picks up on this, you could have a quick fun back and forth as both of you connect on this shared reference. Now you can see why having both sets of skills can help. Each of them dovetail into each other to give you more perspectives and thus more opportunities to be funny. Now, if you are a DM, there are plenty of ways to be funny. In fact, you have the most freedom to prepare to be funny, since you control the world and the people around the players. Just make sure that you don't betray the tone and expectations you've established for your game. Here are 3 ways that I use to make a session funny. 1. Characters have character. NPCs can be caricatures. Now, I'm not saying to become offensive stereotypes here, but you can definitely turn a trait of an NPC up to an 11, because you won't have to play them very long per session. I think of characters like Team Rocket. They show up, they cause trouble, and they blast off again. They're overdramatic, they're theatrical, they take themselves too seriously, and they fail every time. You can use this for your NPCs too. For example, if your characters need to talk with an NPC that associates with the big bad, pick that character trait and turn that dial up. If this NPC is super cringy, super dad jokey or something, dial that up. If this NPC is insecure, make them as insecure as humanly possible. You get the chance to overact whatever this NPC is, because you don't have to deal with them for very long. If they wear out, they're welcome. The players can just leave. The idea here is to commit to this so hard that it becomes funny. 2. References or puns to the real world. Now this definitely breaks immersion, so I reserve this for sessions and games that are a little bit more lighthearted, more comedic in nature, like Flabbergasted. Since my focus there is on comedy, I get to create NPCs, activities, song titles, ship names, things that people might recognize. For example, Prickleback. In that game, they discovered the lead singer of Prickleback, Rad Choger. They later on found a clue, a business card, which of course the purpose is to hand to someone to remind them to contact you. So I used a play on words on the original band, changing it up to make it fit the purpose of a business card. This is how I remind you of who I really am. I know. I accept it. I embrace it. This is just another way that you as a DM can inject some comedy into your game, assuming that it fits the tone of the session. If the game is a more serious one, then shelf this idea, or save it for when you have a more light-hearted session, as opposed to a climactic moment. 3. This is less of a trick and more of a tip. Stay in the moment. This is true for both stand-up comedians and improv comedians. You need to stay present if you want to be funny, because you're getting feedback and material at all times. When someone says something during the session as just a throwaway, that's potential material for you to bring back. When someone makes a reference, that's potential material for you to jump on. If someone makes that Ron Swanson reference when I start describing a character, maybe it's time for me to play Ron Swanson as that NPC. I would miss that if I'm not staying present and not listening. In one of my sessions that was streamed, you should check it out here, there was an NPC that was begrudgingly helpful and very pitiful. When the players were willing to consider letting this NPC into their faction, the NPC was all about it, all in, 100% motivated. Well, another player wanted to call on a random NPC. Now, I read the room, and by that I mean I looked at the chat, and someone in the chat had said, wouldn't it be funny if it's the same guy? And I thought, damn, I wish I thought of that first. And so I used that. The NPC ended up being the same NPC. If I hadn't paid attention to that, I would have missed out on that hilarious moment and the moments to follow. So there are plenty of ways when it comes to the how of being funny at the table. Many more than I've mentioned here, but I think it's a good start. As long as you and your friends are open with the idea of introducing more comedy at the table, then give it a shot. Now, I'm going to talk just a little bit more about how stand-up and improv can help with this process too. Performing comedy in front of an audience gives you two key things that are very powerful. It teaches you to face failure, whether you're bombing the first time, the second time, or decades after you start doing comedy. It humbles you. You realize that most of the time you're not going to succeed. And that's what makes comedy beautiful. Because those failures make you appreciate when a joke does land. Those failures in stand-up give you the opportunity to hone the joke until it's good enough. The continuous honing and failing is what makes great comedy. Comedy also teaches you to face success. In improv, or when you're doing crowd work in stand-up, it's scary to be up there without having something planned out. You get an idea in the moment, and it's hard not to judge it. Is it good enough? Am I gonna bomb? Comedy teaches you to trust yourself and try. It gives you a safe space to express your ideas until you feel confident enough to express more of them. Those successes give you the opportunity to hone yourself until you can say nearly anything that comes to your mind without fear stopping you. It's this continuous loop of failure so that you get better, and success so that you're trying more, so you fail more and try more until you get to a point where you'll still be failing. But your failures feel like you're at a level where someone would say, that was a great show, when you say, it wasn't my best. With those successes, with those failures, you get to a point where you can say things without fear and fail enough to turn them into successes so that hopefully the things you say are making your audience laugh.